They grew up in some of Chicago's most brutal neighborhoods, with nothing handed to them and very few ways out. What they built from that starting point shocked the entire country. This is the story of 7 men who ruled Chicago with a level of power most people will never fully understand. Larry Hoover. Larry Hoover's story started on November 30, 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. But when he was just 4 years old, his family moved to Chicago, a city that would end up defining almost every chapter of his life. Growing up on Chicago's South Side, Hoover got pulled into the streets early. By the time he was around 12 or 13 years old, he had already joined a gang called the Supreme Gangsters. What started with small-time theft quickly turned into something much more serious. But even back then, people could see he wasn't built to just follow orders. Hoover had a way of leading people, and before long, he had worked his way to the top. As a teenager, he started bringing different groups together, building alliances, and creating a much larger organization. Over time, those efforts helped form what became known as the Gangster Disciples. When one of the organization's key figures, David Barksdale, was seriously wounded in a shooting, Hoover stepped up and took control. From that point on, his influence only grew. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Gangster Disciples had become a major force on Chicago's South Side, especially in the drug trade. Money was pouring in, and Hoover's reputation was growing right alongside it. But success in the streets came with consequences. In 1973, he was convicted for ordering the murder of a drug dealer named William Young, and was sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison. Most people figured that was the end of Larry Hoover's reign. Instead, prison became a new headquarters. After arriving at Stateville Correctional Center, Hoover gained influence among inmates. On the surface, he appeared to be a positive force. He encouraged peace, helped reduce violence, and earned respect from both prisoners and prison staff. But behind the scenes, he was using that same influence to expand his organization. New recruits were brought in, connections were maintained, and his authority continued to spread far beyond prison walls. At the same time, Hoover began promoting education and self-improvement among his followers. He encouraged members to stay in school, learn trades, and develop skills that could help them gain power and respect in society. To many people, it looked like a genuine transformation. That image became even stronger when he rebranded the Gangster Disciples as Growth and Development. The organization started supporting voter registration efforts, community programs, and charitable projects. There were clothing ventures, music projects, and public campaigns that appeared focused on helping neighborhoods rather than harming them. As a result, many people began believing Hoover had truly changed, but federal investigators weren't convinced. While the public saw community activism, authorities believed something completely different was happening. According to investigators, the new image was hiding a massive criminal enterprise. They claimed the organization had expanded across multiple states and was generating millions through drug trafficking. The nonprofits and community programs, they argued, were being used to disguise illegal activity and move money. That suspicion led to a lengthy federal investigation. In 1995, hundreds of law enforcement officers launched a massive operation known as Operation Headache. The raid resulted in the arrest of numerous high-ranking members and exposed what prosecutors described as a vast criminal network still being directed by Hoover from prison. 2 years later, Hoover was convicted on federal conspiracy charges and sentenced to 6 life terms on top of the sentence he was already serving. Afterward, he was transferred to the highly secure ADX Florence prison in Colorado, where some of America's most notorious inmates are housed. Even after decades behind bars, debate about Larry Hoover has never really stopped. Supporters point to his messages about education, community empowerment, and personal growth. Critics point to the criminal empire prosecutors say he controlled for years. High-profile figures, including rapper Ye, have publicly advocated for his release, while courts have repeatedly rejected attempts to reduce his sentence. Today, Hoover continues to insist he is no longer the man he once was. But depending on who is telling the story, he remains either a symbol of redemption or one of the most powerful gang leaders America has ever seen. David Barksdale. David Barksdale's story started on May 24, 1947 in the small town of Salis, Mississippi. He came from a huge family, one of 13 children raised by parents who worked as sharecroppers. Life was already tough, but things got even more complicated when his father was forced to flee Mississippi after a dangerous conflict with a white man. Looking for safety and opportunity, he made his way to Chicago, worked hard, and eventually brought the rest of the family north. But moving to Chicago didn't suddenly solve their problems. The Barksdales landed on the South Side during a time when many black families were being pushed from one neighborhood to another by housing policies and so-called urban renewal projects. Eventually, they settled in Englewood, a community struggling with poverty, overcrowding, and rising tensions. Growing up in that environment, Barksdale got pulled into the streets at an early age. By the time he was just 13 years old, he was already involved in gang activity. Things got even worse when, at only 14, he was kicked out of his home after clashing with his father. Suddenly, he was trying to survive on his own, and the streets became his classroom. As more poor black families moved into the area, police attention increased, and violence became a regular part of life. Barksdale found himself constantly dealing with law enforcement, though he managed to avoid felony convictions. At the same time, white gangs were carrying out attacks on black neighborhoods, and many young people felt like nobody was coming to protect them. So Barksdale and his friends decided to protect themselves. That decision led to the creation of a neighborhood group known as the 65th Street Boys. What started as self-defense soon evolved into something much larger. In 1963, Barksdale organized a more structured group called the Devil's Disciples. Made up mostly of teenagers, the organization quickly grew in size and influence. Before long, they were battling not only white gangs, but also rival black groups across the city. As the years passed, the Devil's Disciples transformed into what would eventually become the Black Disciples. By the late 1960s, Barksdale had become one of the most feared and respected names on Chicago's streets. He built his reputation through violent clashes with rival organizations, especially the Blackstone Rangers. His name carried weight, but that kind of power came with enemies. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1968, Barksdale was leaving a bar when members connected to a rival group ambushed him. Gunfire erupted and he was hit 6 times. Most people would have expected him not to survive, but somehow he pulled through. The wounds, however, stayed with him for the rest of his life. More importantly, the shooting changed the way he looked at the world. After coming so close to death, Barksdale began focusing less on gang wars and more on finding ways to stop the violence tearing through black communities. Instead of creating new enemies, he started working toward alliances. That shift eventually led him to join forces with Larry Hoover and the High Supreme Gangsters. Together, they helped form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, bringing rival groups under one banner. Barksdale also began using the organization's influence to support the community. The gang helped fund food programs, medical services, and other neighborhood projects. He became known as King David, a figure many people viewed as more than just a gang leader. Barksdale also built relationships with community activists and worked alongside leaders fighting police brutality and racial discrimination. He wanted to use his influence for something bigger than street conflicts. Sadly, the violence he tried to move away from never fully left him behind. On September 2nd, 1974, at only 27 years old, David Barksdale died from kidney failure linked to the injuries he suffered in the 1968 shooting. His death sent shockwaves through the organization. Without him acting as the bridge between different factions, power struggles erupted almost immediately. The unified group eventually split into the Black Disciples and the Gangster Disciples, triggering years of bloodshed and retaliation. Attempts were made to reunite the factions, but the peace never lasted for long. Jeff Fort. Jeff Fort's story started far from the streets that would eventually make him famous. Born in Aberdeen, Mississippi, in 1947, he was the second of 10 children in a family that survived by picking cotton. Like many black families, chasing better opportunities, the Forts joined the Great Migration and moved to Chicago in the mid-1950s. They eventually settled in Woodlawn, a rough South Side neighborhood where gangs, poverty, and violence were part of everyday life. Growing up, Fort never looked like someone who would become one of the most powerful figures in Chicago's streets. Teachers remembered him as a quiet kid who struggled badly in school and had serious reading problems. But what he lacked in academics, he made up for with leadership. Even as a teenager, he had a presence that pulled people toward him. Kids followed him everywhere, and adults quickly realized he had a natural ability to organize and influence others. By the early 1960s, Fort had already begun getting into trouble with the law, building a criminal record while still young. At the same time, he was becoming a major figure among neighborhood youth. What separated him from other street leaders was his charisma. He wasn't just feared, he was admired. Many local kids saw him as a big brother figure. He bought shoes for children, helped struggling families, and carried himself like a neighborhood celebrity. That influence helped transform the Blackstone Rangers from a small street group into one of the largest gang organizations in Chicago. Membership exploded from a few dozen kids to thousands within just a few years. When gang leader Eugene Bull Hairston went to prison in 1968, Fort took control and rebranded the organization as the Black Keystone Nation. While the group claimed to stand for peace, prosperity, people, and power, its members were deeply involved in violent gang conflicts across Chicago. As Fort's power grew, so did political attention. At one point, some politicians viewed him as a promising community leader, but that image collapsed when federal authorities began investigating a government-funded job training program connected to the gang. Prosecutors accused Fort and others of misusing federal funds, turning the case into a national scandal. In 1973, he was convicted and sentenced to prison. While incarcerated, Fort converted to Islam. After his release in 1976, he returned to Chicago and eventually created a new organization called the El Rukns. Presenting itself as a religious movement, the group gained official recognition, but law enforcement claimed it was actually a cover for large-scale drug trafficking and criminal activity throughout the South Side. Fort's troubles only deepened during the 1980s. Drug-related investigations landed him back in federal prison, where he continued running operations through thousands of phone calls. Those conversations eventually caught the attention of federal agents who spent years recording and decoding them. Their investigation led to explosive allegations that Fort and several El Rukn members had discussed carrying out attacks inside the United States in exchange for money from Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. The case became one of the most shocking gang prosecutions in American history. After a lengthy trial, Fort and his co-defendants were convicted on all counts. In December 1987, the man who had once been viewed as a neighborhood leader, political prospect, and street legend was sentenced to 80 years in federal prison, bringing an end to one of the most remarkable and controversial rises in Chicago gang history. Mickey Cogwell. Mickey Cogwell's story started on Chicago's South Side, growing up in the Fuller Park neighborhood around 53rd and Princeton. Long before his name became known across the city, he was learning the traditions of the original Egyptian Cobras from James Caldwell, a respected figure who had been connected to the club since the 1940s. What Caldwell passed down wasn't gang leadership, it was knowledge, culture, and a blueprint. Mickey took those ideas and built something much bigger. In 1958, he organized his own version of the Egyptian Cobras. The group spread quickly along Princeton Avenue, a stretch of Fuller Park that the Cobras viewed as their home turf. Back then, life in the neighborhood was tense. Racial violence from nearby white communities regularly spilled into black neighborhoods, and many young black residents felt they had nobody protecting them. The Egyptian Cobras emerged partly as a response to that reality, creating a united front against both outside threats and rival gangs. As the years passed, the construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway reshaped the South Side. Families moved, neighborhoods changed, and the Cobras expanded with them. Their influence stretched into places like Englewood, where trusted leaders were appointed to oversee growing Cobra territory. Then came another major shift with the construction of the Robert Taylor homes. Mickey and his family moved into the projects, and he quickly established a Cobra stronghold in a cluster of buildings near 53rd and State. That area became known as the Hole. The nickname fit perfectly. The buildings formed a giant U shape. Enemies rarely entered without consequences, and as many joked, snakes naturally lived in holes. Over time, the Hole became one of the most powerful Cobra strongholds on the South Side. By the late 1960s, Mickey's influence had grown far beyond the Cobras. In 1968, he became a spokesman for the Black P. Stone Alliance, strengthening the already close relationship between the Cobras and Jeff Fort's organization. But that same year brought tragedy when Mickey's younger brother, Jerome Pony Soldier Cogwell, was killed by members of the Devil's Disciples. His death fueled tensions across the city and became a rallying point for the Stones. Mickey's status continued to rise. In 1969, while federal authorities were investigating the Black P. Stones, he was sent to attend Richard Nixon's inauguration after Jeff Fort declined the invitation. The sight of a Southside gang leader rubbing shoulders with politicians shocked law enforcement and gave the Stones a level of legitimacy many never thought possible. As government funding dried up, Mickey helped steer parts of the organization into the drug trade. Alongside other leaders, he played a role in establishing some of the first major heroin distribution networks in the Robert Taylor homes. His connections to organized crime and street politics made him one of the most influential figures in Chicago's underworld. When Jeff Fort went to prison in 1972, Mickey became one of the key leaders keeping the Black P. Stone Nation together. Yet, despite his street reputation, many people viewed him as more of a community activist than a traditional gang boss. He remained heavily involved in neighborhood issues and political organizing. Everything came to an end in February 1977. In the early morning hours, while walking home through Auburn Gresham, Mickey was ambushed by a gunman and shot to death. The killing sent shockwaves through the streets and almost immediately fueled a storm of rumors. Some believed members of Jeff Fort's newly formed El Rukins were responsible, claiming Mickey had been targeted because he refused to align with them. Others pointed the finger at organized crime, citing his gambling ties and business dealings. There were even those who suspected rival Cobra factions that had spent years challenging his authority. But despite all the theories, whispers, and accusations that followed, no one was ever arrested or charged in connection with Mickey's murder. Walter Wheat. Back in the mid-1960s, Fred Gage Jr. and his cousin Walter Wheat were given their own branch of the Vice Lords thanks to Fred's father, who carried major influence within the conservative Vice Lords. The young men called their group the Independence Vice Lords, claiming territory around Independence and Hamlin on the west side. Not long after, another family member, Willie Lloyd, launched the Unknown Vice Lords in East Garfield Park. Eventually, Gage and Wheat folded their crew into Willie's organization, ending the short run of the Independence Vice Lords. Around the same time, another cousin, Horace Willis, helped unite several groups under a movement called the Black Revolutionary Soul Brothers. Their goal was bigger than neighborhood turf. They wanted to push back against poverty, police harassment, slumlords, and the growing problems tearing apart Black communities. Out of that atmosphere came the Four Corner Hustlers. Centered around Madison, Pulaski, Jackson, and Independence, the group was founded by Walter Wheat, Fred Gage Jr., Larry Ford, Richard Goodman, Marvin Evans, and several others. Inspired by figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, and Marcus Garvey, they saw themselves as more than just another street organization. By 1968, the Four Corner Hustlers had become one of the fastest growing groups on the West Side. Because many of their founders were closely connected to the original Vice Lord bloodline, they carried a lot of respect. Walter Wheat, known for his strict leadership style, demanded discipline from members. drug use, and excessive drinking were forbidden. He wanted the organization focused, organized, and united. That image took a major hit in 1972 during a Valentine's Day dance at a church. A confrontation between police officer Henderson Arnold and Fred Gage escalated into violence. Shots were fired, the officer was seriously wounded, and Gage eventually received a 10-year prison sentence for attempted murder. A few years later, Wheat was also sent to prison, leaving the organization without its two most important leaders. While the founders sat behind bars, the Four Corner Hustlers continued expanding. Many members became heavily involved in heroin trafficking, especially on the West Side and in Austin. Inside prison, however, Gage and Wheat remained closely aligned with the Vice Lords and later became connected to the growing People Alliance that was taking shape throughout Illinois prisons. When Wheat was released in 1985, he relocated to Harvey, Illinois, and quickly built a new Four Corner Hustler chapter inside the local housing projects. The organization spread throughout the suburb, creating a lasting presence, but a new power struggle emerged after Monroe Banks was released from prison in 1987. Banks saw enormous profits in Chicago's growing crack cocaine market. Unlike Wheat, who opposed moving deeper into that business, Banks pushed aggressively for expansion. His influence eventually won out, and he became the organization's leader. Under his leadership, the Four Corner Hustlers broke away from direct vice lord control and evolved into a more independent force focused on drug profits and street power. That era came crashing down in 1991 when Banks was murdered during a conflict believed to be tied to drug money and alliances. Wheat briefly returned to leadership, but the organization had changed dramatically. The newer generation had different priorities than the founders. In 1992, Angelo Roberts took control and oversaw a period of rapid growth and fragmentation. Multiple Four Corner Hustler factions emerged, and drug operations generated millions of dollars across Chicago housing projects and neighborhoods. Then came July 1994. Walter Wheat, the man who had helped build the nation from the ground up, was sitting in a parked car on Chicago Avenue when a 17-year-old member of his own organization walked up and shot him to death. Rumors spread that the murder was connected to an internal power struggle, but no evidence ever linked anyone beyond the shooter. Officially, the case ended there. Unofficially, questions about who truly wanted Walter Wheat gone still linger on Chicago streets decades later. Angelo the Don Roberts. Angelo Roberts' rise to power in the Four Corner Hustlers was a story built on family ties, street influence, and a reputation that seemed larger than life. In 1987, he became Walter Wheat's stepson after marrying Wheat's daughter, but by then he was already making moves on the streets. Originally connected to the Gangster Stones, Roberts switched sides and joined the Four Corner Hustlers, where he quickly became one of the organization's most important young leaders. Working closely with Monroe Banks, Roberts helped expand the Four Corner Hustlers' influence into the Henry Horner projects. By recruiting former Gangster Stones and bringing them into the fold, the Fours established a powerful presence around Washington Boulevard and Damen Avenue. As crack cocaine exploded across Chicago during the late 1980s, the organization grew rapidly, along with the violence and criminal activity that came with it. One of the darkest chapters of Roberts' early years came in 1988 when a murder investigation pulled him into the spotlight. The victim, Stephen Edwards, was found tortured and beaten to death behind a grocery store on the West Side. Investigators traced the killing back to a basement apartment inside Four Corner Hustler territory. Evidence suggested Edwards had been restrained, repeatedly beaten, and stabbed before his body was dumped. The case ultimately led to the conviction of Eugene Royney, one of the organization's founders, who received a life sentence. Roberts, however, refused to cooperate with investigators and avoided criminal charges by remaining silent throughout the case. His refusal to testify only strengthened his reputation on the streets as someone who would never turn against his own people. Over the next few years, Roberts continued building his name. He was linked to several criminal investigations, including allegations that he was involved in the shooting of a Chicago police detective in 1990. Once again, he avoided conviction. Every time he walked away from a case, his status seemed to grow even bigger. By 1992, at just 22 years old, Roberts officially became the leader of the Four Corner Hustlers with Walter Wheat's blessing. He inherited an organization that was already powerful, but he pushed it to another level. Under his leadership, the Fours expanded across Chicago and into nearby suburbs. New factions emerged, and drug operations inside the Henry Horner and Rockwell Gardens projects generated enormous profits. Roberts was also surrounded by stories that turned him into a street legend. He was known for his discipline, avoiding drugs and alcohol while encouraging younger kids to stay focused on school. At the same time, tales spread about his martial arts skills and his willingness to stand up to both rivals and police officers. Whether every story was true hardly mattered. His reputation had already taken on a life of its own, but his rise was short-lived. In 1992, authorities launched major raids targeting his organization, sending him back to prison. After his release in 1994, he became the focus of another federal investigation involving allegations that he was trying to acquire military-grade weapons. Authorities claimed he was connected to a plot involving an anti-tank rocket, though debate over those accusations continues to this day. Then, in January 1995, Angelo Roberts' story came to a violent end. Police found his body inside a vehicle on Chicago's South Side. His throat had been cut, and the killing showed signs of a brutal attack. No one was ever convicted for the murder. Rumors immediately spread throughout the streets. Some blamed rival factions, others pointed toward old grudges within the Four Corner Hustlers, and still others believed his conflicts with law enforcement played a role. The truth remains unknown. What is known is that Roberts left behind a lasting legacy. Decades later, some Four Corner Hustler factions still carry his name, a sign that his influence continues to echo long after his death. Antonio King Tone Fernandez. Antonio Fernandez's story started in East New York, Brooklyn, where he grew up in what looked like a regular working-class family. His mother was deeply religious, and his father worked hard delivering bread for a local bakery. But once Antonio hit his teenage years, the streets pulled him in. Crack cocaine became a major part of his life, and before long, he was trapped in a cycle of addiction, hustling, and frequent trips to jail. It was behind bars that his life took a dramatic turn. While locked up at Rikers Island during the early 1990s, Fernandez encountered the almighty Latin King and Queen Nation. At the time, the organization was expanding rapidly throughout New York under the influence of Luis Felipe, better known as King Blood. Felipe had built a powerful prison-based organization that offered protection, structure, and a sense of identity to many incarcerated Latino men. For Fernandez, who later became known as King Tone, the group arrived at a moment when he felt completely lost. Battling addiction and struggling with his future, he was drawn to the organization's message of unity, respect, knowledge, and self-improvement. What began as membership soon turned into leadership potential. By 1996, King Blood was facing serious legal troubles, and leadership of the Latin Kings passed to Fernandez. His rise was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies, symbolizing the transfer of power. Once in charge, Fernandez launched a major campaign to reshape the organization's image. He pushed for stronger discipline, banned certain drugs, encouraged members to focus on education and family, and expanded leadership opportunities for women by emphasizing the Queen Nation alongside the Kings. Under his leadership, large gatherings were held in public parks across New York and New Jersey. Thousands of members attended rallies focused on accountability, anti-violence messages, and community empowerment. Fernandez promoted neighborhood cleanups, peace efforts, and activism against discrimination and police brutality. To many supporters, he represented a new direction for the organization. But while the public saw reform, federal investigators saw something very different. Law enforcement agencies spent years building cases against the Latin Kings through surveillance, informants, and undercover operations. Prosecutors believed that behind the speeches and community programs, the organization was still heavily involved in drug trafficking and racketeering. According to federal investigators, large-scale heroin and cocaine operations were continuing throughout Brooklyn and beyond, with Fernandez allegedly playing a central leadership role. In November 1997, federal authorities launched a major sweep, arresting Fernandez and dozens of other members. The investigation only expanded from there. Then, in May 1998, Operation Crown delivered another massive blow, leading to nearly 100 arrests connected to the organization. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, Fernandez eventually pleaded guilty in January 1999. He admitted to participating in a conspiracy involving significant quantities of heroin and cocaine during the same period when he was publicly presenting himself as a reform-minded leader. The guilty plea immediately ended his role as Supreme Inca of the Latin Kings. Later that year, he stood before a federal judge and accepted responsibility for his actions. He apologized to his family, supporters, and community, acknowledging that he had failed to achieve the vision he once promoted. He received a sentence of 12.5 years in federal prison. After serving roughly 9.5 years and earning reductions for good conduct, Antonio Fernandez was released in 2008.